am really very pleased to have Jenny Taylor, Dr. Jenny Taylor, join us today on a very important research tool and approach that she's used, but also the subject matter that she's applied it to, I think, could echo with many of the people here in terms of the concerns that underpin her questions in her research.
I feel very honored to be asked to speak to you. I've got 20 minutes, I think, just to, and I shall be reading a paper because you actually do condense. I think there's less waffle. But I would say that I am a career journalist who just got a really good story, and you will understand more by the end of the paper. It turned into a PhD ridiculously, but I'm a journalist through and through, always will be. I do also slightly want to say that it may be, the paper may reflect a kind of corkscrew experience. And my experience of research was that you start at a level and then you just sort of, you go down deeper and deeper. So there may be a certain repetition because I've actually described the process. So with that small caveat in mind, I hope you will be entertained. It's extraordinary to spend 6 years of your life with a bunch of government minutes and find it exhilarating and hilarious. Anyway, so if you're all sitting comfortably, the title of this paper is The Words People Use. My PhD is called After Secularism, Inner City Governance and the New Religious Discourse. I've been invited to speak about my methodology, which was discourse analysis. I think, though put me right, Francois, because it worked quite well in a nebulous area of study, and because it uses the stock in trade of journalists, which is words. What does a journalist do when they want to find something out? They ask questions, then write down the answers they're given, quoting the actual words used. Woe betide any journalist who makes up a quote or who cannot substantiate the quote they say they got. In fact, it happened to me last week. I was interviewed for a newsletter and misquoted by somebody who actually put quote marks around what I was alleged to have said. Not only was it untrue, it was pointless. It wasn't going to affect anything. For it reflected the presupposition of the interviewer rather than the news, what was new. And I will tease out what I'm getting at here as we go through. I set out to study secularization theory, which I hope is something not completely alien to you. It's a sociology of religion theory. But it wasn't until 5 whole years into my part-time research that I learned about a particular methodology that would help me really test secularization theory. And this methodology was using actual words to tease out my thesis. Until then, I had been using keyword searches, oddly enough, which is essentially what discourse analysis is, but I've been doing it informally. Probably because I'm a journalist. It is very interesting how this works. My hunch was that the social system was desecularizing, whatever that meant, in response to immigration, that the theory was biased towards Christianity. Mosques and Hindu libraries were being built on the public purse. Catholic nurseries, on the other hand, in London's East End were being refused funding on religious grounds, because they were religious. And indeed, as the first race relations reporter in Westminster Press, which I was, this is a non-existent group of newspapers, and one of the first in the country, I had journalistic evidence for a two-tier system in operation coming in from all over the country. A two-tier system, which is a familiar phrase at present. It ran counter to the theoretical propositions of secularization to do with differentiation, language, identity, and effect. 4 propositions of secularization theory that I needed to test. What was more, I learned that the government was actually using the Church of England to get its inner city policies enacted. They were using its plant, its buildings. They were using its personnel and language, both in and outside government, in default of any other available to them to administer what sociologists were calling twilight zones of migrant settlement areas. These were areas of human and social need, particularly characterized by riots and extraordinary deprivation. They were political tinderboxes. Something had to be done. Not only this, the government had set up a whole new unit in the Department of Environment called the Inner Cities Religious Council, tasked with change. This was an absolute innovation. The language of practicality and re-engagement of, in quotes, divided sectors of society and religious groupings, close quotes, characterized the PR that had come to my notice as a journalist. Brian Wilson, the sociologist summarized by Carol Dobbelair 3 whole decades later, said that secularization was a long-term process by which religion ceases to be significant in the working of the social system. I wanted to test how fit that definition of secular was to describe the part of the system that coordinates activities, i.e. the government. Through something rather beautifully called the aesthetic of research, or just good old good luck, I found myself on a platform with a civil servant running the ICRC, the Inner Cities Religious Council, and he offered me access to 5 years of government documents to investigate my hunch, breaking the 30-year rule on the release of government documents. They were clearly worried about what they were doing. So I had my field, my topic, but as yet only a hit and miss method, keyword searches with no provenance that we knew of, either my supervisor or me. I did a lot of background reading on secularization and methodological theory. I understood that discourse is talk about talk, but that did not seem all that promising. People talk, you think. Politicians are always accused of just talking. It's why journalism exists, to hold them to account for the things they say. I would have proved nothing if I had managed merely to log lots of religious blather from meetings and well-intentioned conferences. I had to understand context first in order to understand what talk is and does in this particular field. There are various well-developed and productive ways of examining talk, which I think is interesting for this seminar. There's discourse analysis, there's semiotics, which is signs or language signs, and there's documentary analysis, just 3 of the possibilities. These methods can be defined as 1, an analysis of the language in context, the context being the undisclosed power struggles that give rise to certain usages, or texts and talk in action, as opposed to just cognition. And 2, analyzing the words as signs of structures encoded in the text itself. And 3, understanding what the document is, who made it, how it works, what reality it generates. I decided to apply a mixture of the first and the third, agreeing with MacDonald and Tipton that there are limits to the understanding that can be developed using only the texts. Meanings and hence facticity vary according to the circumstances of text's use, a phenomenon referred to by two scholars, Punch and Jupp, and I have submitted a recommended reading list, which might be of help. In terms of religions, another scholar, George Lindbeck, puts it helpfully. Words and sentences are made comprehensible by indicating how they fit into systems of communication or purposeful action, not by reference to outside factors. Their reality as meaningful signs is wholly constituted in any individual occurrence by their intratextuality, by their place, so to speak, in the story. That is very, very important for us guys. There was therefore a much deeper level of research required. The credibility of the thesis demanded not just a lot of context, but also that the discourses produced demonstrable results. And this is where it started to get interesting as I encountered John Austin's speech act theory. I'd be interested to know how many of you've heard of John Austin's speech act theory. Austin, we can discuss that later. Austin argued for the practical, performative nature of language. In his famous Harvard speech given in 1954, Austin coined the term speech act as an attack on the increasingly futile debate about the referential or truth value of language. Austin argued for the practical nature of language. Words perform. They do not merely describe, truthfully or otherwise, the inner world. I decided to stretch his usage somewhat to discourse as a whole, and I write in my thesis, Austin's insights proved invaluable in finding something substantial to base a case upon in the peculiarly intangible theoretical world created by secularization discourse, which purports to describe the insignificance or irrelevance of religion, but ends up through talk creating it so. Jonathan Potter argues that language is used to do things. It is a medium of action. And he discusses the whole gamut of actions that language performs. Was there a case to be made based on what the language about religion in the ICRC minutes did or did not do? So I started with fairly ad hoc interviews with 4 people I was able to justify as being the main players to establish what their intentions had been, including a government minister, which is fairly amazing. They all wanted to change the status quo, to end deprivation and discontent in the inner cities, which were becoming a political liability for Thatcher. So I should have explained that this was actually the Thatcher-Blair era, the crossover between the two. So it was very, very exciting era in a way. They all identified the faith groups for social leverage. Could I test their intentions against both outcomes and theoretical axioms to access any evidence of real theoretical lacunae? The words they used in themselves provided the researcher with sufficient grounds for requesting documents related to the ICRC to see what they might reveal about a new religious discourse in government circles. And as I said, this is a bit corkscrew because it was at that point that I then met the chap running the ICRC, who offered me these documents. And once I had them, I was able to apply various devices of methodological interest, intertextuality and intratextuality. That's the relationship between texts. Multivocality, understanding where the different speakers are coming from, and document theory. So to go into this in a little more detail, and I haven't actually got much more to say, I'm probably running out of time, but I think I have a few more minutes. I took 4 of the tenets of David Martin's secularization theory and then tested each one. I won't go into that here, but I should say, as I said at the beginning, that he was one of my 2 PhD examiners. The interviews were the key to the documents. They provided the indicators of what to look for in the documents. And religion is a very capacious, slippery word, and I use it in inverted commas, because the study would contribute to a definition of the word as it was being used at that point in history, implicitly and explicitly, during the research period in government. The procedure adopted for examining the interviews and documents was to take note of any material relative to Brian Wilson's theoretical religion is insignificant, 0 baseline, and then any evidence in the documents of a change from this bottom line, just the existence of religious words and phrases, whatever their meaning in this context, were taken to count in the initial analysis. Such keywords and phrases from interviews were later correlated with the first set of documents to be examined, minutes of 5 years of meetings, can you believe it, and evaluated as evidence according to certain criteria, which again, I won't go into. Except to say that if a minister acknowledged religion as a factor in the identity of those to be administered, I mean, that was a total shift. We had to leave our religion at the door of the BBC, I was told, at around about the same time, in fact. Now your religious identity was actually a part of levering access and change into the inner cities. It indicated that the church had significantly influenced the way in which he carried out his brief, or documents about the business he helped transact, which might in some measure confirm the fact and effect of that influence. I plunged perhaps haplessly into the texts I'd been given, which with an initial keyword search, and followed the paper trails through to reports of outcomes as the way to assess both the prevalence of certain signifiers and their performative nature. And it was at that point that I reached an impasse, simply because neither I nor my supervisor at SOAS had heard of discourse analysis, which emerges from within linguistics and social psychology. The use of keywords in interviews and minutes over a long enough period, and then tracking those keywords carefully by these paper trails to conference reports, recommendations for action, publications, books, and other palpable actions, concluding with the 5-year review, all these things help me identify not just the existence of discourses per se, but nuances, change to them, and struggle within those discourses, which is very much what Foucault was dealing with. Then all I had to do was compare my findings with the theoretical literature. So to conclude, faith group had a new connotation in late 20th century England, since the emergence of Muslims, Sikhs, and Hindus, among others, into the perceivable parameters of government discourse caused by globalization. A faith group was not simply a nunnery, a band of men at prayer in the Middle East, but a new social and political entity now recognized, or partly recognized, by British government in the administrative and legislative process, because the groups in question had exerted significant power by means of the ICRC, which I was able to trace right from the beginning through to the first 5-year review, where certain issues appeared on the minutes was very key. Language usage depends on power, according to Foucault and his followers, i.e., who uses the knowledge implied in the language, what caused that knowledge, and with what intent. This journalist then had enough material on what was going on, both intended and unintended, to write her story. That story ran to 100,000 words is perhaps indicative of the complexity of being a journalist in a multicultural society trying to avoid mayhem. Thank you very much.
You referred to in the beginning about secularization theory, and I just would like you to say a few words around that, because I don't think everybody would be familiar with that as a theoretical frame. So you, if you just say a little bit about that, and then we can open up questions about method and discourse analysis.
Sure. Yes, I apologize if I wasn't clear enough about that. Secularization theory, according to particularly Brian Wilson, who wrote his first book on it in the 1960s, has it that religion ceases to be significant in the workings of the system. And he also describes it as the leaching of a sense of the transcendent from the workings of the system. So, in other words, we no longer are governed by reference to the divine, or by holy books, or by our own, I mean, if we have faith, you keep it out of your work. So that's what I mean by differentiation, that you can be religious in private, but not in public. And on top of this is the view that it's inevitable. And Brian Wilson makes the point that it actually picks up on evolution, that to be more evolved is to be less religious. It's the inevitability aspect of this theory is very pronounced. So a more sophisticated society is less religious, and it's left up to you, to cope as best you can, if you happen to have a faith. I hope that's clear.
Thanks. And obviously, we could talk a lot more about the relevance of it then and the relevance of it today, and the headlines we're seeing all around.
Yes, we are a quarter of a century on now. Well, since I did my stuff, never mind Brian Wilson.
And the kind of notion of the inevitability of secularization
it's changed. It has changed since then, Francois.
Absolutely.
And and I did actually in one version of this paper, I actually did say that the 5-year review of, I mean, you said don't worry about your conclusions, but it is perhaps, in view of what you're asking me, important to say that the ICRC was regarded as its work as having seeped into the rest of government. So even though it was closed down after about 10 years, nonetheless, and that is a follow-up study that needs doing, is just, how much its work seeped into everything else. It was quite a useful prism through which to look at a particular shift in sociological history, I think.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating, because we could probably see echoes of that if we were to apply that lens to the NHS. I mean, in all sorts of other places.
Well, indeed. And this Visions of Reality book, which I'm very sad doesn't seem to, it's called Religion and Ethnicity in Social Work. And it was extraordinarily, I mean, it was just like, an explosion in the context. And it was launched by Paul Boateng, who was Secretary of State for Health. So there you are.
Thanks very much, Jenny. It was really, really interesting. I just had a very simple, I had a few things swirling around in my head, but just a simple initial question about John Alston. I just wanted to understand a little bit more about him. And I'm sorry, I didn't catch the name of the theory that you mentioned. The
speech act theory.
Oh, okay. Speech hyphen act. Okay, got it. Yep.
The words do more. Words don't just disappear or evaporate. That the word has agency. All words have agency. That they perform. They're performative, and they may be negatively performative in terms of what you say is not what you mean, or what you say doesn't bear out in what you do. In which case, that's also very telling. And I think this is a very incredible way of getting at the whole question of, is journalism true?
My observation is that language is tied to a particular culture, distributed in a culture, and for instance, in the UK, it's mostly Judeo-Christian worldviews. But so when we talk about secularization, we take religion to the fringes, but culture now undergoes an admixture. So you realize that when this is happening, for instance, the Hindu will use the word and await baptism by fire. For them, it is not a religious connotation, but it has another meaning. Now, how do we differentiate this in terms of what is singularly religious and what is just the normal usage that is understood in a particular society? Thank you.
I think I get your drift, Justice, but put me right. I'm not just interested in religious language, I'm interested in all language, obviously, but for the purposes of this thesis, I was looking at religious language, but I was also looking at the language of change. I also do know that very little comparative work has been done in the sociology of other religions, and this was a huge vacuum when I was at SOAS. There are one or two, I mean, I can only think of one distinguished scholar, Ernest Gellhorn, I think his name. But, you know, I've been out of that a bit of the academy for a long time, who had actually done a comparative piece of work on the sociology, I think, of Islam and Christianity. But sociology of religion began as the study of the decline of religion. I mean, that's its basic orientation. So in a sense, it's cutting off its own legs because it can't objectively, openly admit that the theory is wrong, you know, that it's not declining and that it's doing something else, whatever it may be doing. But in terms of the linguistic content or the you know, John Austin's performative content of language in other cultures, I can't presume to know that or talk about it. And I think it is an absolutely fascinating proposition, if that's what you're saying. And I would, you know, this work has got to be done. I think it's a very fruitful possibility. Have I sort of got at where you're coming from?
Yes, thank you.
I just wanted to sort of try and just to make sure I'm clear in my own mind, particularly the relationship between the interviews and the documents you then analysed. So am I right in thinking that sort of the interviews sort of identified intentions in relation to secularization theory, and then the minutes were where you went for evidence of what had actually happened?
No.
Whether the words had been put into practice or not, or how
no,
is it?
Not quite, David. I mean, the interviews were just an initial scoping, you know, go and chat to a few people. And in the course of that, I got to realize who were the main players in terms of the setting up of the ICRC. I wasn't talking to them about secularization theory. I didn't even know there might be a connection at that stage. I was talking to them about what they were doing because I had a hunch that something innovative was happening, which completely, you know, drove a truck through the theory. But I wasn't preempting my findings at all. I mean, you can't exaggerate the sense of lostness one experiences and the huge inchoate nature of this kind of project at the outset, and you're full of despair, and then occasionally you get the light, you know, and in the course, you know, one interview and then another, and there were just connections. about what this innovation really was, and the language in which they were with which they were describing it, whether they were a government minister or a former social worker or an Anglican non-stipendiary minister who was working in the government under Thatcher. You know, all this language was itself worthy of study, of interrogating. So I recorded the interviews, I typed them all out. I went through them with a keyword search to establish whether, because I was the first race relations correspondent, as I say, one of the first in the country. I don't think they exist anymore, but all the discourse that I'd been involved in had been to do with race. And then I discovered Tariq Madood, this Muslim, he'd written a huge report that, on diversity, saying that people from with Islamic backgrounds don't think of themselves in terms of race. What matters to them is religion. And they come from all sorts of different races. So this is, again, an ideological solipsism, if you like. And his work, he did it at Oxford, and we became friends. He was so helpful with my research. And so what I was noting through these interviews was that the discourse of race just didn't turn up at all.
Very interesting methodology and approaches to research. I'm very interested in the theory of secularization. Thank you very much. And I'd like to say that this seminar is as interesting as all the previous ones. So thank you, Francois, also. What do you think about the connection between religion and politics in some countries? Sometimes religious organizations are supported by political systems connected with fundings. And you probably know that Russia is conducting a major propaganda campaign in Ukraine to strengthen the Russian Orthodox Church. And it is a little funny, but also very sad that this, sometimes some priests concentrate muscles before the killing Ukrainians with before this process, and the media is involved in this process. But Ukraine has its own traditional Orthodox Church, and as a scientist, as a journalist, how do you think about preventing the spread of religious propaganda materials?
You know, you think of the Russian Orthodox Church, and you think of Putin standing in front of the stadium filled with tens of thousands of people, speaking about greater love hath no man than that he lay down his life in order to go and kill Ukrainians. And so what you do is you methodologically is you look at the words, you look at the context in which the original words were spoken, which was, you know, and then you look at what his words actually are doing. So if language is performative and his language has been taken out of context and then is being used to kill people, well, there you've got a case. It's so easy to make the case in that one example. And in fact, you know, I would advocate articles, you know, that could be written just simply saying that, using this methodology quite coldly and scientifically. He took those words out of context. And I'm sure you know, you must remember, everybody must remember Putin saying this. He said, greater love hath no man than that he lay down his life for his friends. And what he meant was go and kill Ukrainians. It is repulsive, disgusting, you know, and evil. And there you have your story.
Your research raises a question for me in a specific current context. So I'm currently reading a book by Robert Putnam called The Upswing, where he's tracked in U.S. society how religious affiliation has political and sociological research in the U.S. has tracked how political affiliation has actually tracked religious affiliation has tracked political affiliation, not the other way around. So that since the 1970s, people have drifted to more conservative and more politicized churches in the United States as the Republican Party has drifted right word. So you studied the secularization of society. Did you also, and I think this kind of follows on Natalia's question, did you do any research? Did it lead you into viewing the politicization of religion?
Yes, that was my findings.
Mm.
It was very obvious through using this method, and combined with Foucault's analysis, that was what was happening. And I discovered that there were, this multivocality is a very important feature of this method, because you've got to look at each individual context. And of the people who set it up, one chap was really passionate about regeneration of not just the built fabric of these areas, but the life world of the people who lived in them. He also, oddly enough, had been a non-stipendiary minister, so he was brought in because of the. He's done some amazing work to do with regeneration. So he was non-political, although he was very switched on. But the government minister obviously had Thatcher on his back, and these areas were going up in flames. I think we've forgotten. And so it was, as I said in the paper, it was a political liability. So you had that motivation, and then actually you had another NSM who was genuinely motivated by goodwill. He genuinely was interested in people. He genuinely wanted to improve life for them and incorporate them. I mean, the Church of England acted as gatekeepers for migrants. They actually opened the doors of the establishment and let them in very deeply into the workings of the government. And it was perfectly obvious that the different groups on the ICRC who all met fell out with each other, and they stopped running the conferences because there are contested realities, there are contested aims and objectives, and the conferences just didn't work because they became a slanging match. It was very sad. And through the manipulation of the agendas, you got the sort of equality rose, political equality rose to the top of the agenda, and regeneration failed. And that was the conclusion of the 5-year review.
I am Helena Shapovalova, and I'm an associate professor of Uzhhorod National University. And I'm interested in media linguistics, and want to ask you, what do you, and I should say that our conversation was very interesting for me, of course, and I want to ask you, what do you think? Is it possible to study the context and the all linguistic nuances of modern text, media text, with the help of artificial intelligence? Is this a near-term prospect, and do you have experience in such study? Jenny?
That's another amazingly enormous question, and very, very interesting. And I just think about myself, trawling through these dreadful, dreary documents for all that time, and whether I could have applied. I'm sure I could have applied a robot to pick out the keywords, and even possibly have trained it to nuance the keywords. But if I may just say, an article that one of my freelancers, because I ran a media charity after my PhD looking at all of this, and he wrote a fascinating article on developments at that time. And he ran it through ChatGPT last week. And what was so stunning was, first of all, how brilliant it was. Absolutely riveting and accurate on the face of it. Completely faithful to the text, and even faithful to the meaning of the text, in the way the robot voices had been trained in idiomatic language, and conversational modes. It was a revelation, but what was so eerie and would say ominous was the fact that there was no context for the article. And these two robots were tremendously enthusiastic about religion being taken seriously again in analysis and discourse. Well, fine, but there was absolutely no sense as to why it had lost plausibility in the first place. You know, the long trajectory from the Reformation and the religious wars and so on, you know, that partly produced secularization, all the power struggle. I mean, it was missing in terms of the words the robots were using, beautiful American voices, and in terms of the nuance of the discourse. So for AI to be applied for really thoughtful research, I do not think, as somebody said at the conference, Francois, it's backroom stuff.
Thank you so much for making time. Thank you for your interest, your questions.